I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the New York Grower 2023 special series. This series has been specially commissioned by the New York Wine and Grape Foundation for your listening pleasure. Across these episodes recorded in February and March 2023, we'll be exploring the modern New York scene in the company of 6 growers. The series will also feature a deep dive into the New York Wine and Grape Foundation's Sustainable Vineyard certification. Absolutely reflecting the most up-to-date realities of grape growing in the region. Given my listeners' level of interest and the wider wine trade's interest in quality grapes as the basis for quality wines, a series I'm particularly excited to share and a real landmark for the channel. Subscribe to be alerted when new series episodes go live. We continue the series today in the company of Kelby Russell of Red Newt Cellars. Kelby introduces us to his early days at Red Newt and the broader grape growing philosophy. We take a deep dive into the Red Newt sourcing policy, discuss tonnage versus acreage contracts and the implications, talk microclimate of their growing sites, before comparing and contrasting their 2 Riesling growing sites, and following the fruit right the way through into the cellar, discussing winemaking and blending. Enjoy.
All right. Hello, my name's Kelby Russell. I'm the winemaker here at Red Newt Cellars on Seneca Lake in the Finger Lakes. But winemaker is a pretty all-encompassing job here at Red Newt. A lot of different hats that I wear in terms of, helping represent the Finger Lakes and represent the winery abroad and making the wine. But anyone who knows anything about wine knows that the wine making starts in the vineyard. And I feel like I've had a lot of plaudits over the years and rewards or attention based on some of the wines that I've made. But it's always been clear that the styles of wine that I've been able to work on have to do with the work that we do in the vineyard to get the grapes here in a very particular condition, which is a beautiful ripe condition that's a little bit maybe different than what people expected from the Finger Lakes 10 or 15 years ago. Red Newt, it should be said, founded by Dave and Deb Whiting in 1998. As a husband and wife duo. I came in 2012 and started taking over the winemaking in 2013. And I was lucky here. When I was looking for a winemaking job, Red Newt, right from the beginning, even though it didn't have vineyards under its own name, which made it a little bit of an outlier in the Finger Lakes at that time in the region's development, Red Newt did have this incredible ethos of supporting local, which is something that I think we take for granted now. There was a bistro on site that was very local focused, and we think, oh, yeah, local for food, blah, blah, blah. But, 1999 in upstate New York, that wasn't even a thing in, we would say it wasn't a thing on the East Coast of the U.S. In terms of like spots where you would have expected that to be the hippest and taken off yet. That was really far ahead of the curve on the food side. And the same thing was true in the winery. Red Newt was working with very specific vineyards right from the start that were particularly good at various grapes or different styles and really highlighting those. And it's kind of a feather to Red Newt's cap that we were the first winery to do single vineyard bottlings in the Finger Lakes, starting with a 2004 wine. You would win a lot of bar bets if you were to guess or to ask people to name the first single vineyard wine in the Finger Lakes or what the grape was, because everyone would say, oh, Riesling. It's got to be Riesling. They're like, maybe, I don't know, Pinot Noir or Cabernet Franc. It was a Merlot. So a real kind of oddball, I suppose, other than the fact that it was a beautiful wine from a beautiful vineyard. And that was the whole point of labeling it as a single vineyard. So in any case, at least for me as a young winemaker, when I was looking where I wanted to go, it was clear in 2011 when I was kind of poking around that Red Newt had the right idea, at least to me. They had this sense of premium and quality and single vineyard bottling that to me felt so naturally where the wine world was and is going. that they'd already figured that out. So I loved jumping on board that, and found a winery that, beyond that emphasis on single vineyard, was also not opposed to me as the winemaker and the winemaking team going out into the vineyards as well. Again, that wasn't necessarily an obvious. It's something that oftentimes your interaction with the grapes as a winemaker is maybe going out and sampling the fruit, and then really when it hits the crush pad, it's kind of like from there forward. But I had a different vision for what I wanted to do, partially because I knew I wanted to push the boundaries of what was considered typical for Riesling in the Finger Lakes in terms of harvest parameters and how it was being taken care of in the vineyard, and that was going to ruffle some feathers. And I knew that if I wasn't out there on the front line, it might not really get done. And even if it was getting done, I wouldn't necessarily have the full buy-in or respect of the grower that was, really tasked with that particular site. So fortunately, I had that support from Red Newt, and it was something that we learned by trial and error, and the that we learned was, how do we maximize the ripening potential of Riesling, in particular in the Finger Lakes? How do we really give ourselves as long a window to harvest as possible? And not because we're looking for big alcohol or tons and tons of sugar, right? Like that's not really the game in the Finger Lakes, even in a hot year. We'll be at 12.5, maybe 13% alcohol in our dry Rieslings. We weren't going anywhere crazy there. But the thing that you see in the vineyard, and anyone who's worked with Riesling, the sugar might have stayed the same from last Wednesday to this Wednesday, but the grapes will have turned from green to gold. And the flavors that you get are totally different as a result. I mean, I think that is not surprising. That's intuitive. We all know how, the difference between an unripe or a ripe peach visually. But getting that across in a winemaking sense was a real, I don't want to say it was a challenge, because I was successful in it, but there was like a mental switch that had to happen. A grape grower is understandably, they're fighting Mother Nature. I mean, maybe they're working together with Mother Nature. We can try and be more polite about it, but really, it's in a climate like the Finger Lakes, you're doing everything you can to scrap out every last bit of ripeness you can because of what the climate throws at you. And if you're a grape grower and you get to, we use bricks as our sugar measurement system in the vineyards here, but you get to 20.5 bricks or 21 bricks. If you're a grape grower, you're like, great, I've crossed the finish line. Pick the fruit. Let's get it. No reason to risk it anymore. Like, let's get it in. So to have, at the time I was 24, 25, to have this like young kid basically come in and say, no, we're going to hang on to it for another week and a half. And the grape grower says, the sugar hasn't changed. Like, what did we gain in that 10-day period? Like, why did we risk so much for no sugar gain, right? Because everyone's kind of oriented around sugar as the be all. But the results in the wine, I mean, the sort of flavor concentration, the nuances of flavor, the sort of weight and texture that you can get into the finished wine because the fruit was more physiologically ripe, even if the sugar was the same. It's a totally different style of wine that opens up. And for better or worse, it's a style of wine that's more, at least on the top end, is more what we consider the like international examples of the best Rieslings, right? When you're kind of up in that like top 1% of the Riesling world, you're talking about Großgewachs or Austrian Smaragd, or these, like Alsatian Grand Cru. Those are all wines that are coming from really intensely ripe fruit.
This is great to, really have the time to really delve into this part of the operation, I guess we'd call it, really, and really take this deep dive into grape growing, into that all important part of winemaking, really. So I think what would be great for me, and I think great for the listener, is actually just to take a step back and to really understand the nature of, I guess, Red Newt's sourcing policy, while
Yes.
bringing in the people. Who were those people that you were kind of interacting with, as you already referred to there, as that 24-year-old going out there and telling them to risk all of their crop, basically.
Yeah, I think Red Newt started as and remains a winery, and always believed firmly in having the best possible fruit sources, which is, I don't know, I feel like every tech sheet says that. But in our instance, I would guess maybe 10 years of sourcing fruit from a few vineyards. Dave Whiting, the founder, really honed in on a couple of sources that he thought were going to be really special, and ended up reaching out to those growers or the owners of that property. So in the short instance, it's Harlan and Ken Fulkerson at Lahoma Vineyard, father and son, Fred Wickham of Tango Oaks Vineyard, and then Tony Damiani of Glacier Ridge Vineyard, and then John Santos of a spot called Curry Creek Vineyard, which I guess very appropriately, although not intentionally, for the name Curry Creek, does Gewurz and Pinot Gris. But reached out to them and really kind of coordinated either firm commitments for their entire farm in the instance of Glacier Ridge or Curry Creek, and then the ability to work with them really closely, or with Tango Oaks and Lahoma, actually set up an arrangement to pay for new plantings. So Red Newt was covering the cost of establishing the vineyard and getting it up and running and having access to that fruit for the long haul. And that was a good move for Red Newt, and a bit of a daring move. No one was doing that in the Finger Lakes. It was a good recognition on Dave's part that at that point, Red Newt wasn't at a place, I should say, to have a vineyard or a vineyard management team. But, the recognition that ultimately your wine quality comes down to having access and very stable access to really good fruit, and locking that in the best way that you could. So this was kind of the stage that I entered with these characters on it. With Tango Oaks and Lahoma, those were both planted in 2007, basically 2007 to 2009. So by the time I entered in 2012 and 2013, we were really still only on the first couple of crops for those vineyards. Things were still, the vines were very young still. The style was still kind of coming into focus. Curry Creek had been providing fruit probably since 2006, certainly 2007. It was a little older. And then Glacier Ridge was planted in various stages, but kind of from like the late 90s, early 2000s onward. So those two did have a bit more of an established personality, but Tango and Lahoma were kind of a little bit of the Wild West. I think for both those vineyards, when I first started, when we would make single vineyard bottlings out of them, they were kind of in that like juicy, fruity Cabernet style. It's always been my joke that young vine Riesling is kind of like Shirley Temple. It's very precocious. Like it really has like all this great energy and fruit to it, but it doesn't necessarily have the acid structure to be a great dry Riesling. That just takes vine age. There's no real shortcut to that. But those were the sources that we were working with, and the sort of the personalities that we were dealing with. And the personalities were, it's an eclectic group of growers. I feel like any four growers in a room are going to be eclectic, but you had the Fulkersons, Ken and Harlan, who are very salt of the earth, upstate New York, born and bred, and they have the upstate New York accent, which is more and more rare. But they were just like old school growers in that way. and no nonsense. This is how you do it. Harlan, who is the father, who was the main grower when I first started, for the first few years, was running the vineyards as a day job, and then was working third shift at a salt plant every night. So this is the sort of character that existed there. And then over to Tango Oaks with Fred Wickham. Fred Wickham, you have someone who is actually a graphic designer by trade, and his family had owned property in the Finger Lakes, had actually owned the building that Red Newt's now in originally, and had started a winery in the late 70s that had gone bankrupt, like many of them did back at that time in that very first wave. And he'd gone off and made his fortune elsewhere in graphic design, and then saved up the money to come back and buy a bunch of the family farm back. So that was where that vineyard came from. It's a very different person. John Santos is looks like a wild mountain man. I don't know how else to describe him. Like, he's just, he both looks like a wild mountain man, but then will also just kind of like wax poetic about the birds and like, what the honeybees are doing, and like, you're just kind of along for the ride whenever he starts chatting with you, which might be perfect for Gewurz and Pinot Gris. And then Tony Damiani is like an IT guy for Cornell, and has this, in the context of the Finger Lakes, relatively small vineyard site that's almost entirely reds, right? Like, this is even kookier in the Finger Lakes. He has a tiny bit of Riesling, a tiny bit of Pinot Gris, but then tons of Merlot and Cabernet Franc and Pinot Noir and Syrah. Like, that's really where, he grew up. I mean, with the last name Damiani, there's an Italian-American connection. Grew up drinking Italian red wine and wanted to make Italian red wine in the Finger Lakes, by and large. So I don't know. I always have said that going from vineyard to vineyard was like, it's almost like you needed a passport to get around them, because there were such different people and also such like flabbergastingly different management styles, from the old school grower to the newer school grower to the like kind of hippie grower to, like the small boutique red grower. And I think the biggest temptation in that setup is that, at least as a winemaker or someone who approaches them, is that you want to go in and say, oh, you're doing X wrong. You should do it this way. Like, this would work better for you. Or, over on the other side of the lake with this other grower, this is what we're doing and this is what works. And I think I was maybe a little bit overwhelmed and then a little bit lucky that I didn't try and do anything like that. I was always much more like, hey, they're the grower of this site. The site needs to carry their personality as well. Like, the personality of the grower is as important as the soil is or as the fruit is. And to try and like make them pretend to be something they're not is going to throw the balance off. And that's largely, that's still true up to this day. I mean, it's been 10 vintages for me now, 11 vintages.
I absolutely love these different descriptions, and almost as you finished there, Kelby, I was kind of taken back to that, the idea of, you walk around and you see people with, walking around with these dogs that look exactly like them. And I was sort of taken to that place of, the vineyard starting to kind of take after the owner. And I think it's a really important point there. You described it as the different passports, but it's effectively culture, isn't it? The connection that people have there. And really, I always remember being taught and told that the culture is, how things are done around here. And I think that, even to make a connection back to what you said at the start there, I just think, you being present there out in the vineyard, actually, not just sort of literally or, metaphorically telephoning it in. I'm sure that was also helpful to kind of, to understand what the site was giving you, but I guess also what the people were, what you were going to ask of them, what risks as they may have seen it that you were going to ask of them. And maybe, to kind of round out that point, and I think it is something that you did refer to in our, pre-conversation really, is really to bring in that element of price, because I think that, often maybe on a slightly more kind of agricultural only element, I think, that part of the story. Presumably, it's you pick when it's ready because there's less risk. So yeah, maybe bring in that element, as well as being there on site, as well as recognizing the personalities and the attachments and the histories of individual growers. But say something about the pricing element, I guess, and the way that people are, I guess, incentivized as well on a pricing level.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think being there in person was also in some ways evidence to those growers that we were as invested in what was going on as they were, that we cared as much, that it wasn't just about how it showed, just get it to the crush pad, I don't care.
Yeah.
And that we were really passionate about it. And I think after a year or so of this and kind of getting a sense for what worked in the vineyard, and what worked in the vineyard for what we're looking for Red Newt is a pretty, at least in the Finger Lakes and maybe even in the larger wine world, a little bit radical, which is a lot of fruit dropping, especially close into harvest, going through with people who know what they're looking for and selectively pulling out any fruit that doesn't look ideal or doesn't look like it's going to make it for the long haul that we're asking it to do. So we're talking about kind of second half of September, early October that we're doing this. It's certainly common to hear about green harvest back in July, August, but to be out when the fruit is actually pretty close to harvest date and dropping 10, 15, 20, 30% of it on the ground so that what remains can stay clean and keep ripening. That's not the way things had been done. Things were, you would usually pick, right? You would pick based on the sort of lowest common denominator, not exclude it and take a loss and then keep allowing the rest to ripen. And as we pieced this together, that this is what really worked for us and what we wanted to do, we shifted in some ways fundamentally what we did for pricing. So Red Newt, like the vast majority of the wine world and probably the entirety of the Finger Lakes up until that point, was paying for fruit based on tonnage delivered. So we'd weigh it when it showed up. We'd call the pick dates. That was a lot of the tension with the grower, is deciding the pick date, because the longer it hangs, the more maybe bird damage or deer damage, the more potential rot pressure, or if it's a dry fall, the berries start to dry up. This is a good thing, but they start to raisin a little bit, and if you're a grower and you're getting paid by the ton, you're watching your profits evaporate away, literally. And we totally shifted how we did business in that regard and changed the growers over to acreage contracts. So rather than paying by the ton, which is a little bit, I don't know, it's very volatile, especially in a cool climate. Depending year to year what your yields are going to be. We just pulled that out entirely and said, we're going to pay you X thousands of dollars per acre every year, regardless of what comes out of it, unless it's like catastrophically low or is over the top high. There are some upper and lower boundaries to it just for protection's sake. But if you're a grower, it gives you a really steady sense of income, which is usually lacking on the farming side. It gives you something you can plan on and bank on. And it meant that we were kind of partners in the risk with them financially when we were asking them to hold on to things. And when we were going out and dropping fruit, we were hurting our own bottom line as much as we would be hurting theirs, right? So we were making this calculated decision that, yes, we're doing these things in the vineyard. Yes, it's costing yield or costing potential money, but we're that committed to it and think it's worthwhile doing, that we're still protecting the grower and kind of shifting that risk onto ourselves.
The money and the risk side of things is obviously huge, but I like this. I like this part of the story of you kind of being present and almost, as you say, being partners and structuring it so that so there's equity really, and in looking at really the way that I do business as well and my motivators, I think that actual real sustainability for grape growing and for winemaking is a huge personal motivator, and I think that those things that you're talking about there, I'm so happy that that you're sharing them, because I think it does then make the kind of the whole a lot stronger, doesn't it? Because I guess you're able to come in with as well a winemaking hat, with a market focused hat as well, and kind of think very holistically about how the grapes are grown, the different sites that they're being sourced from, and those, I guess, what might be minutiae in some circumstances, but when you take the step back and you think about what people are asking for, the styles, the evolution, that and thinking long term about how I guess also the wines are going to age, it's kind of all encompassing, really, isn't it?
There's this real guiding sense to what is happening in the vineyard and then happens through in the cellar now. There's just a union of those efforts towards a single common goal. And it doesn't mean that the growers don't roll their eyes a little bit sometimes at what we're doing, not because they outright disagree with it, because if they do disagree, I want to know that, because I trust their instincts more than ours out in the vineyard. But if they're like, okay, there's a lot of the like, well, you're paying for it, right? It's like they're not upset. They're kind of maybe scratching their head a little bit, but that it's been a fascinating journey because of that.
And I should note, this is effectively a sequel to a conversation that we had at the end of last year, which is on the podcast in episode 479. So today we're very much focusing a lot more on the grape growing side of things. But obviously, once you've listened to this, then jump back to 479 to kind of feel yourself in on more the winemaking and maybe the Kelby's backstory as well, which is also very fascinating. I think where I'd take the conversation to, Kelby, is again really I think something that we did cover maybe at a slightly high level first time round, but it's actually that interplay between geography and geology, and I think it's great that even so far you've kind of named these different sites. We know what is growing where, and I think that will therefore knowing, for example, that Lahoma Vineyard is a source of Riesling, as is Tango Oaks. And as you say, Curry Creek is more Gewürztraminer and Pinot Gris, and Glacier Ridge with the reds. I think that will give us the sense of really what the earth and what the microclimates around those different sites is giving to the grapes.
The Finger Lakes it's not rare in the wine world, but I think it's accentuated in cold climates, that the microclimate of a given site is so critical for what you plant there and how it grows in a way that, it's not as forgiving here. So a site like Glacier Ridge, which we have the reds in, is one of these sort of quintessential banana belt sites, which is this colloquialism that was kind of an inside joke in the winemaking community here about the southeast stretch of Seneca Lake as being the warmest subregion in the Finger Lakes, right? The joke, haha, you could grow bananas. But it took on a life of its own, partially because it's a good term, and you don't know and should turn down a good idea when it pops up, and partially because it's really descriptive of this stretch of Seneca Lake where you have really steep slopes. They're steeper in the south in the region than the north because you're closer to the Appalachians where the glaciers carved things out. So you have steeper slopes, and on the east side, it means that your exposure is towards the afternoon and evening sun. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, I would say it doesn't mean a huge difference one way or the other for Riesling. I might have people who disagree with me on that. But for reds, that increased afternoon and evening sun results in a totally different type of expression in the glass. Not better or worse, because we do pull some reds under my own label. There are some reds that come from the exact opposite side of Seneca Lake, but those two wines are worlds apart as a result. The reds from Glacier Ridge have a real density to them and darkness, both in color, but also sort of like tannin extraction and a smokiness that has nothing to do with oak or winemaking. It's really just what's coming from that vineyard site. and how intense the sun is. We infamously tried to do a live stream tasting from Glacier Ridge in, I'm going to say June or July 2020. So in the middle of the COVID shutdown, and we were, doing, like everyone was doing these things to kind of connect people to the stories and give things for people to kind of tune into. And the live stream went terribly awry because all of our phones overheated in the sun, and we couldn't keep going. And that, which I suppose is appropriate, but it does speak to how real that particular terroir is and what that geology does for us, or the geography, I suppose. Geologically, all four sites give us something totally different. Glacier Ridge, there's basically no topsoil to speak of. There's about 6 inches of topsoil, and then you're straight into shale, which, again, for red wines and for sort of concentration is a really good thing. You have really sort of naturally limited vines, whereas usually in the Finger Lakes we're dealing with too much vigor. So this is a site that kind of is of its own volition a little bit lighter yielding, a little bit more concentrated, and can really ripen those red grapes beautifully. Then just up the road from there you have Curry Creek, which is another relatively well-protected site. That's I should have mentioned that even with Glacier, you have sites that are closer to the lake. And the closer you are to the lake doesn't freeze over. The last time the lake froze over was 1911. And as a result of that, it means on some of these cold snap nights that we get in the winter, grapes, or vines, I should say, that would be more sensitive to damage from cold temperatures, the closer you are to the lake, the better. So that's in some ways why you have this prioritizing of red grapes at Glacier Ridge. Curry Creek, you have Gewürztraminers, a relatively finicky grape, a pretty, a grape that needs to be handled with kid gloves during the winter. So that's a nice protected site for it. And then when we get to the Rieslings, Tango Oaks is, I love Tango Oaks. It's such a quirky site. It used to be part of the slope going down to Seneca Lake. It's in the banana belt, but the site is now relatively flat. And the reason for that is that it was filled in by a flood in 1936, or was the washout point for a flood that dropped 0.5 meter of rain in a day. And everything came cascading down the hill. Where Tango Oaks is was kind of like a break in the hill or a swale. And it got filled in with about, depending where you are in that vineyard site, somewhere between 4 meters and 6 meters of gravel. So there's very little loam, very little topsoil. It's nothing but rocks. In the Finger Lakes, we just, I don't know if it's come through in other conversations. Our biggest enemy is we have too much water. We're the opposite of a lot of American wine regions, I suppose, where anything that helps us get water away from the vines is usually a better thing. So gravel is about is you couldn't ask for much better than gravel in that regard. And then our outlier in some ways, because those 3 vineyards that I've just mentioned are all clustered together within probably roughly 2 kilometers of each other, right around the winery on this.
They're all on the banana belt.
Yes, yep. La Homa is due across the lake. And it's equally a beautiful site. It gets more of the morning sun, which is good because it's a little bit higher elevation than our other sites. And that means a little bit more risk for especially frost in the fall. Spring frost isn't really a concern, knock on wood, yet in the Finger Lakes. We aren't at that point in the climate change cycle here. But frost in the fall can be an issue. And to get sun on the vines earlier in the morning makes a difference. But the site otherwise is probably most notable for being on a really rare soil in the Finger Lakes, which is sandstone. And given my long preamble about how water drainage is so important, you can imagine that sandstone is a great rock type for allowing a vineyard to really push the sort of ripeness boundaries without having to worry about disease pressure.
What's I guess really interesting, I think, those 2 Riesling sites particularly being so different. I guess as well, kind of those relationships being already established when you kind of, came to Red Newt and kind of came to the piece. I'm curious then, what you spoke before in terms of the hang time and, your vineyard practices. I guess, how do those vary? Using those two as the kind of the Riesling example I was kind of, diving in there. And then also, maybe talking a little bit through to actually then what happens in the cellar, in terms of, bringing those two together. Are they kind of kept apart and bottled as single vineyards, or do they sort of, come together into making something different in terms of a blend?
With Tango Oaks and Lahoma, I mean, we have two sites that we're dealing with relatively similarly once we're getting into the harvest season in terms of this fruit dropping, really trying to keep things very clean so that we can extend the ripening window. We treat them in the vineyard quite similarly at that point. There is a little bit of a difference between the two in terms of their how they're grown, of course, different growers. But generally, at this point, come September, they're honing in on the same point. So we're dropping fruit in both equally. We don't usually have enough. We usually don't have enough bodies to do everything we'd like to at the same time. So we do have to pick and choose a little bit, or divide and conquer sometimes. Or sometimes it's a question of where we want to go for lunch, and we shift our location based on that. But then the fascinating thing is that after all this, we get the fruit into the winery, and Tango Oaks comes in about 2 weeks before Lahoma on average. It's a really stark difference given how similarly we treat them otherwise. I don't know. I feel like you would expect them to be a few days apart, but it's worlds apart. The Tango always is riper faster, and maybe some of that's banana belt, some of that might be clonal selection, but it does come in at a much earlier point, which is in some ways great, right? I mean, it gives us a chance to really focus on it and work with it on its own terms rather than having sort of an overwhelmed reaction to all the Riesling at once. And to the question of how we work with them in the cellar, we work with both very similarly, and kind of what we would have talked about last time in terms of cold soaking and pressing off and long spontaneous ferments, but we do keep them totally separate. I think that's maybe a bit of the question that anyone would want to ask. Do we end up, throwing them together? And we do we make a dry Riesling, right? That is going to be a blend to some extent, but it's almost never, ever, ever a blend that's done up until the very last moment. And by the last moment, I mean the following August, right? I mean, it's not even the next spring. We keep the two wines entirely separate and let them really come into their own for almost a full year before we would ever consider blending any lots together.
Could you maybe, say something about the blending? I guess the kind of the blending decisions then that kind of bring those together once they're at that stage in their evolution where they're showing really, I guess, their sense of place.
This is a question I'm not going to be the best at answering because we don't actually blend all that much anymore. And maybe that speaks a bit to how we've worked with the vineyards over the last 10 years. When I first came here, blending was a huge part of what we did at Red Newt. Our dry Riesling, Circle Riesling, we would make a dry reserve blend. It was a real sort of like chemistry lab situation. And now it's much more common that we know, X is going to be Tango Oaks Riesling, and obviously from that vineyard. We know this block is going to be, it's a block that we call the Knoll. That's our very best site at Lahoma. That's always going to be its own thing. And as the wines have fermented, they've really, it's not to get like overly spiritual or woo-woo or anything like that, but like the wines really do kind of start to signal what type of wine they want to be as they're fermenting. So we'll have a few different ferments from Tango Oaks. We'll have maybe 6 or 7 different blocks of fruit from La Homa that are all fermenting separately, that have all been treated separately. And we get a really clear sense over the course of the winter and spring, oh wow, this block really, this speaks to me of our dry Riesling. It has the right character, the right fruit. It seems like it's going to dry out in the correct way. Oh, this tank over here, this actually has a lot more of like a semi-dry component to it. And we just let the wines kind of coast into those finish points. Now, there is a little bit of blending that happens at the end, but it's blending that's done at the fine margins, might be the way to put it, right? If I know that I've got a 7,500 liter tank of really nice dry Riesling from La Homa, but I wish it just had a little bit more, maybe a little more like orchard fruit to it. Well, then I'll go and I'll look at one of the Tango Oaks dry Riesling tanks, and maybe 3% of that or 4% of that will find its way into the blend. It's kind of like these last little tweaks, as opposed to sort of like, I don't know, 30% of this, 15% of this, 10% of this, 5% of this. It's less and less of that. And it's more about letting not just a vineyard speak, but letting an individual ferment from that vineyard speak.
A massive thanks to today's guest, Kelby Russell of Red Newt Cellars. Do be sure to visit rednewt.com, where you can learn more about the project and find their main social media handles. Please help to amplify the episode and the New York Grower 2023 series by sharing the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/518. You can, as ever, find links to all 7 series episodes in the description below. And of course, I'd love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, and at Wine Podcast on Twitter. Next time on the Interpreting Wine New York Grower 2023 series in episode 519, I'll be speaking with Mike Calizzi of Cashon Glen Vineyards. Make sure you're subscribed to be alerted when that episode goes live. See you then.